Welcome back, everyone, to freepilotgroundschool.ca. We're going to move from the mind-numbingly boring to the mere ordinarily boring, we'll call this. There is some good information, though, in this lesson on aerodromes. Hopefully, you've done your reading in your AIM, and we'll get started right away. So some introductory materials on aerodromes. An aerodrome, this section 301 in the CARS to all non-certified aerodromes. So these are typically going to be the aerodromes that you see kind of in the country. A farmer has his own aerodrome. Some of the smaller grass strips, they will. A larger airport, let's say like Toronto or Kitchener, Montreal, Prince George, those are all certified aerodromes or airports. Talking about some markings, this is pretty important. You might see this on the test. X's indicate that a runway or taxiway is closed. So if you're flying overhead an airport and there's a big X on it, it's probably best you don't land on it. Here is something important. You might see this on a test, a wind direction indicator or windsock. It indicates the direction and approximate speed of the wind, and it is straight at 15 knots. On aerodromes, non-certified aerodromes, you will see an orange wind direction indicator, and a striped windsock indicates an airport. There's some discussion about airport lighting or aerodrome lighting that you may see if you're flying at night into an airport, and you obviously need a minimum amount of lights in order to land at night. The minimum is you need a runway that has white lights on the side. The bonus part, you might see green lights at the beginning of the runway, red lights at the end, and sometimes center line marking down the middle of the runway. On the taxiways, you typically see blue lights along the perimeter, and in large airports, you'll have green center line taxi lights. Any intersection between a runway and a taxiway or a taxiway and an apron is usually denoted by two lights side by side. So here's some obvious stuff, but unfortunately I have to go through it. You can't block an aerodrome or discharge a firearm or create a hazard. Should be pretty obvious, but people are pretty dumb these days. You also can't smoke or create a fire hazard on a movement area. Not surprisingly, the exact same regulations apply to airports in addition to the aerodromes that we were talking about before. However, this time it can't be contrary to the airport certificate. If an airport operator wants to make a rule that you can start shooting your shotgun on the airport property, well, I guess you can do it, but it has to be in accordance with the airport certificate. Seems kind of silly anyway. I don't know why anyone would allow a hazard or something like that. And again, you can't smoke or create a fire hazard. Okay, let's move on to some questions. You'll see these are some of the more sample questions from your pre-solo, your P-STAR test that you will do at some point in your flying career. First question, airport is A, an aerodrome with paved runways. So we know that's not the case necessarily. B, an aerodrome with control tower. No, there's lots of airports without control tower. C, a registered aerodrome, or D, a certified aerodrome. Well, the correct answer is D. It's a certified aerodrome. Like I told you earlier, there would be a question on some sort of exam on the wind direction indicators or windsock. So for some reason they call it a dry Transport Canada standard wind direction indicator. In other words, a windsock, when it's horizontal, indicates a wind speed of, and we know this because we memorized it earlier, it is 15 knots. No person shall operate any vehicle on any part of an uncontrolled airport used for the movement of traffic, except in accordance with permission from A, the operator of the airport. Yeah, sounds reasonable enough. B, airport security officer. Not quite sure. Lots of airports don't have security officers. C, a federal peace officer, so RCMP. Well, that seems kind of silly. You have to call the police when you want to drive your truck across the airport property. D, a qualified flying instructor. Could be, but let's be honest, a lot of airports don't have flying instructors. So process of elimination, let's go with A, operator of the airport. Here's another subject that I promised you would be on some sort of test or exam. Runways and taxiways or portions thereof that are closed to aircraft are marked by, we memorize this, white or yellow X's. Here's a question that I apologize, I don't think I talked about in this lesson, but it is covered in other lessons in, I believe, flight operations. So the west end of a runway oriented east and west is numbered. So I don't know if you can recall from your reading anyway, that runway markings, the numbers on the runways, correspond to the degrees that you're heading. So here we're on the west end of a runway. So the west end of a runway means we're pointing east, and east is 90 degrees. And because there's only two numbers, two digits in the runway marking, we could take off the last digit, round to the nearest 10, 90 degrees, rounded to the nearest 10, take the 0 off, 09. So runway 09 is going to be the west end of a runway that's going east and west. Here's our last question, where taxiway holding positions have not been established. So those lines on the runway or on the taxiway, aircraft waiting to enter an active runway should normally hold. And the correct answer is going to be 200 feet from the edge of the runway. Okay, that concludes this lesson on aerodromes and airports. There's quite a bit more that you'll learn about this later on in your flight operations sections. But for now, this is kind of the minimum amount that you need to know for your P-STAR exam that's related to aerodromes and airports. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk to you in the next lesson.